Yeah.
Okay, so let's start. So welcome to the GLO seminar. I'm really pleased to introduce, my colleague in British academia, my co-author and one of the leading labor economists in the country, Pedro Martins. Pedro is going to talk about basically his pitfalls of no poaching agreement among employers. As usual, I know you're all familiar by now that the things that I say, the seminar is being recorded, and please mute your microphones. And Pedro is happy to answer any questions you have during the presentation, so please feel free to unmute and ask questions. We'll try to be punctual as usual, try to finish at 2 because Pedro has another seminar to go to. Okay, with that, Pedro, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation, Matthew and Klaus. Thank you for all the great work that you do at GLO. I think it's really a fantastic organization in disseminating labor economics and labor-related themes even further. So I'm really happy to have the opportunity.
Pedro, I think there is some issue with your microphone. Maybe if you could, I don't know if it's sometimes we lose your. Okay.
I'm sorry. Maybe my internet is not perfect. A little better now. Okay. Very good. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm presenting a joint paper with Jonathan Thomas, who is also here with us. So as Matlub indicated, this is about coordination or even collusion between employers in the labor market and the potential effects that may have in terms of the training that employees receive. This is research conducted in the context of a project that is funded by the European Union, so the usual disclaimer applies. And this project is specifically about employers' associations. So employers' associations are, as you know, groups of firms that operate in the same industries, in the same regions. They have similar interests, so they come together. They tend to be very active in collective bargaining. But of course, because they have many similarities, all these firms, they may also conduct additional activities. So the project is about that. A number of universities in Europe are working on this. In this paper, we focus on the potential implications in terms of collusion and training. I have a couple of pieces of motivation. Actually, they come from the United States, but I think they may also be relevant from an European perspective. So the first one is this article in the New York Times from a couple of years ago that indicates that a number of firms, especially in the fast food sector, including McDonald's and others, were engaging in these no-poach arrangements. So this meant that if you were a franchisee of, say, McDonald's, then you'd agree not to hire workers that were employed in other franchisees of the same restaurant chain. So this, of course, implies that as a worker, your opportunities to find other jobs, potentially better paying jobs or jobs that were better for you because perhaps they were closer to the place where you live, those opportunities would be diminished. Okay? So there would be a negative side to that. Of course, from the firm's perspective, that would have advantages because these workers would be less likely to leave. They would save on wage costs, on recruitment costs. This particular news article mentions the situation where these firms agreed to drop these clauses in their franchise contracts. And that was in part due to work by Orley Aschenfelter and the late Alan Kruger that identified that in a very large number of franchisee contracts, these clauses were present. One aspect which we thought was particularly interesting comes in the second part of the article, where they say, if you can see this, this paragraph, that well, on top of the potential effects in terms of wage costs, these contracts helped protect these firms' investments of time and money in training employees. So, of course, if the probability that these workers will leave to some other establishments, if that probability is lower, then of course that can create a better environment for these firms to invest in the training of their employees. Okay, so that is a large part of the tension that we explore in this paper. I have a second example, a more recent one from 2 months ago, which is about, again, from the US, a charge from the Department of Justice with a number of firms that were engaged in some form of wage fixing. So they had segmented the labor markets of the different businesses in a given industry. And by doing that, they were restricting the opportunities for workers to move and improve their salary. So these no-poach agreements can, I think, play an important role in labor markets. And I think the literature is now considering them more seriously. And I think that's possibly quite important. So our perspective is focused on the specific role of employees associations. So I mentioned them before. This is the main theme of this bigger research project. As I said, these associations, they represent a number of firms that operate in the same industry, in the same region. And they can play an important role in many ways, namely by providing what I call these sectoral public goods. So this could be about collective bargaining. This could be about representation activities. These will be services that will have an element of non-rivalry in the sense that once a collective agreement is completed, that can be used by many firms simultaneously. So there is a non-rivalry dimension that will give this dimension of public goods to these activities. Now, at the same time, because all these firms are operating in the same industry, they supposedly are competing against each other, but by having the opportunity to come together and discuss these issues, this can also facilitate some form of collusion amongst the firms that are affiliated in the employer association. And this could be relevant in terms of the product market. So they may decide to increase the prices of the products and services they sell, but this also may be relevant in the input market, including in the labor market, which is specifically the issue that we are interested in. And to give you an idea of the potential relevance of employer organizations, I have at the bottom part of the slides some recent statistics from the OECD with the percentage of employees that are employed by firms that are affiliated in employer associations in each country. And so you see that, yes, in some countries, employer associations are not very relevant, but in some other countries, namely in Europe, they can be very, very important. So the extreme case is that of Austria, where all firms are required to register with an employer association, but in many other countries where such a requirement does not apply, you still have many firms that are affiliated with employer associations. The scope for these potential collusive practices is actually, I think, quite relevant, and not only in terms of the product market, also in terms of the input market and specifically the labor market. So I'm happy to take questions, as Mathilde mentioned. I think that I'm not sure if I have to do anything particular, but or Matlub may tell me if there is a question. I'm happy to answer that. Thank you. Okay, so what we do in this paper, so we want to study the potential no poaching agreements that may be developed in the context of these employer associations. Of course, this is in many ways a very difficult goal because these agreements will most likely, if they exist, they will be of a tacit nature. They will be about business owners coming together over lunch and sort of coming to an understanding whereby I will not recruit your employees if you don't recruit my employees. And if we both do it like that, then we will be able to keep our workforce more stable. We will not have to match the outside offers of these employees from each other firm. And in that way, we will be able to save on labor costs and recruitment costs. I personally have heard lots of anecdotal evidence of this nature, but I don't know of any research that tries to investigate this in a more systematic way. As I mentioned before, there may be a silver lining because if there is lower levels of mobility of this nature, then firms, and in particular firms that are involved in these agreements and affiliated in employer associations, may have a stronger incentive to provide training to their employees, which will lead to higher levels of productivity and possibly even higher levels of wages later on. So more specifically, what we do is we ask these two questions mentioned in the slides. If there is lower levels of mobility of workers between firms that are affiliated in the same employer association, and if the workers that I just mentioned, refer to them as EA workers, so I mean workers that are employed in firms that are affiliated in employer associations, okay? But to make it more simple, I just say EA workers, if these EA workers receive more training compared to workers that are employed in similar firms, but which happen not to be affiliated with employer associations. So what we do is we have a model of worker training and mobility. So that's the theoretical contribution of the paper. And then we have an empirical part in which I look at matched employer-employee data for Portugal, which includes information on the affiliation of the firm and on the training of the individual employee. Okay, so by using data of this, I think there is a question perhaps, or is it a legal requirement for companies to get registered with the Employers Association? No, it is not. So it's a choice. If a firm wants to become a member, they may want to do so. And of course, this raises questions about the comparability of the firms of the two types, which we also try to explore later on. But as I was saying, so what we find from the theoretical and the empirical perspective is that indeed workers that are in these affiliated firms are less likely to move to another firm that is affiliated with the same employer association. Okay? So this is evidence supporting this idea that employers associations may play some role in restricting the mobility of their employees. And moreover, this sort of silver lining element also appears to be present because we also find very large differences in the training that employees in the EA affiliated firms compared to employees in firms that are not affiliated with employer associations. There are very large gaps whereby the EA workers receive much more training than workers in similar firms, but which happen not to be affiliated with employer associations. So We also have some additional results regarding lower levels of mobility, in particular separations of workers in EA firms, and not very large differences in terms of the wages paid by the two types of firms. Okay, so those are the main results, which in our view are consistent with this idea that employer associations may play a role in restricting mobility of workers, while at the same time increasing the level of training of their workforce.
Pedro, there's a question from John. I don't know if you saw that in the...
About wages, if they get more training but are not paid more, then it is abuse of market power. Yes, I would agree with that. So it may be that indeed these workers, so most of the surplus coming from this practice is going to the firms, because even if they are getting much more training, the wages are not increased in a proportional way. So in the end, I mean, there will be a social benefit from the more training and the resulting increased productivity, but the distribution of the wages will not be reflected. So for some reason I cannot move the slide. Yeah, I can. So what about the literature? So I mentioned some papers, a very small selection of potentially relevant papers here. So first I have the paper by Aschenfelter and Kruger, which I mentioned before. So they conduct this analysis of the franchisee contracts in the US, and they find that more than half of the contracts have clauses that restrict this poaching dimension. So, more specifically, they have clauses that establish no poaching arrangements. I also mentioned the paper by Smoglu and Pishki, where they find that even in the case of general training, if there are imperfections in labor markets, if there is wage compression in the labor market structure, then firms may have an incentive to invest in the general training of their workforce. So if we go back to the sort of standard model of Becker, there is this very clear distinction between general and specific training, whereby specific training is of use only in the firm where it is provided, whereas general training can be used in other firms. And the point by Becker was that workers would have to pay for the general training, because if not, then they would move and get higher wages and the firms would lose out. But if there are imperfections in the labor markets, then general training to some extent becomes specific training. And firms may have an incentive to invest on that, possibly because, say, if the wage structure is compressed, the wages will not increase by the same amount as the increase in productivity. So firms will have an incentive in provide general training. There is a smaller literature on issues of mobility of workers between firms.
Pedro, just an issue quickly. Typically, there are interactions between specific training and general training. If you cannot read and write, you cannot learn more specific company issues. Isn't this relevant?
I'm sorry, I did not get the first part of the question. You mentioned interactions between general and specific training?
Yes, there is typically an interaction between general and specific training. You cannot be specific if you have not some general training. So if you cannot count or cannot read or write, then it's more problematic to have acquire firm-specific human capital.
Yes, I agree that it can be difficult to establish this very clear-cut distinction between the two. I mean, if a worker learns Excel or some software in the company, I mean, there will be some degree of firm specificity, there will be some degree of generality. Maybe it's more relevant to talk about industry-specific training rather than firm-specific training versus yes, I think these distinctions are not very clear cut. I'm using the very simplified distinction between firm specific and general, but I agree that this is a somewhat crude simplification of the complexities of potential interactions that you mentioned. I think there is another question here. Why would unions accept these terms? Okay. So unions tend to be interested in conducting collective bargaining. Indeed, if wages are not increasing in a proportional way to the increase in productivity, they would be unhappy about that. Is it that unions are not aware of these practices? I mean, I think it's a good question. I don't have a detailed answer right now, but I would agree that if this is an arrangement that benefits mostly employers, then trade unions would be unhappy about that. Maybe they would try to bargain more heavily towards higher levels of wages. Maybe this is their way of trying to ensure that there is a fairer distribution of the gains from the increased training. I mean, my experience is that trade unions are also very keen on training, of course. They see investments by firms on the training of their workforce as a very important area. They press a lot for that. So maybe that explains to some extent their sort of attitude towards these issues. Perhaps let me just mention. So I was about to mention the fourth bullet point. So of course there is this fast increasing the literature on the new monopsony. So I mentioned this paper by Azar and co-authors that came out last year in the Journal of Human Resources. Where they analyze the number of, say, potential employers in particular local labor markets for particular occupations, and they find evidence that if workers are in such local labor markets where there is a number of opportunities, then their wages tend to be depressed because of that. So it suggests that indeed fewer opportunities in terms of employment can have a negative effect in terms of their wages. The last bullet point is about a number of papers that I've conducted using similar data sets that I will present next on some issues that are also relevant in this paper. I will not go in detail, but I invite anyone that may want to know more about this to consider those papers as well. Very good. For some reason, sometimes I cannot. Okay, no, there we go. So so let me sketch the paper, the theory that we have in the paper. I would say is a fairly complex model. It tries to consider the sort of the main choices and activities that firms and workers conduct in this context. So one particular feature is that after a first period in which the worker is with a firm and receives training, then there is a second period in which the worker may move to a different firm. Okay? So with some probability, the worker will receive an outside offer, and with some different probability, that outside offer will be attractive in terms of representing a wage that is higher than the wage that the worker otherwise would receive in the same firm before. So there is some possibility that the worker will leave, and in particular when the worker is better matched with this second firm. Okay, so there are there are these match-specific dimension that is quite important in this model. So there are a number of results. I can list them quickly and then give you a little more detail. So, for instance, we find that when outside offers are limited, which is something that could arise because of employer association affiliation, then firms will provide more training. So that's one of the key results that we find in the empirical part as well. Mobility is also lower when outside offers are limited. So again, if a firm is affiliated with an employer association, and if such affiliation tends to imply that no poaching agreements will apply, then workers will be less likely to move to other firms. Now, things are not as straightforward as perhaps I suggested, because it is not necessarily the case that if there are restrictions in these outside offers, wages will be lower. So these outside options also play a role in terms of benefiting workers, because this means that they can receive a higher wage in their second firm. So so part of the advantage of being in the firm in the first instance is that in the second period they may have the opportunity to move to a better firm that will pay them a higher wage. Okay, so it's not clear cut that restricting outside offers will necessarily be a bad thing. Okay? So this also takes us to issues that have to do with whether or not it is a dominant strategy to be in an employer association. So you can think about a market in which most firms are in employer associations. And in that sense, the opportunities of finding jobs in different types of firms will also be affected. So perhaps let me skip directly to give you a little more context on the actual key dimensions of the model. So this slide lists a few of them. So it's 2 periods. We are assuming risk neutrality and no discounting. And as I said before, there is a first period in which the firm is hires the worker, and will offer them a wage contract, which will include a wage in the first period and also the wage in the second period. And these 2 wages must be such that they will meet the participation constraint of the worker. Okay? So there is this minimum level of utility that the worker will receive from these 2 wages. And if the wage contract is generous enough, then the worker will accept this offer. The training is conducted exclusively in the first period by the first firm, and this will involve a cost. And we also assume that the amount of training will be the same amount of the productivity of the worker in the second period. Okay? So then there is the issue of the efficiency of the level of training, which will be the one that will maximize the surplus driven by the difference between the productivity from the training and the cost of the provision of that training. Okay? So then we bring in the probability that the worker will receive the outside offer from a different firm. Okay? Use this parameter phi. So the higher the phi, the greater the probability of receiving the outside offer, which will be something that will apply mostly for firms that are not affiliated with employer associations, under the context that employer association membership will have a negative effect on these probabilities, because these no poaching agreements will apply. And then we get to this issue I was emphasizing before about the potential improvements in the productivity of the worker in the second firm, if it happens that they are well matched. Okay, so we have the productivity in the second firm, as indicated by the training that the worker receives in the first firm, plus this parameter theta, which indicates this match quality dimension, and which follows a given distribution. So that it could be that the worker in the first firm, when they receive the offer, if they receive the offer, actually it turns out that it will not be a good offer because the match is not good. But it could also be that the match is better with the second firm, and in that sense, the productivity will be increased. It's the same worker, but just because the person is matched to a different firm, then the productivity will be increased. We also consider issues of bargaining power, which are relevant in terms of the distribution of the surplus that may be generated with the second firm. There will be a gap between the outside option of the worker in the potential second firm, which is the wage that the worker would receive if the worker were to stay with the first firm, and on the other extreme, the maximum productivity of the worker in the second firm, which under this notation would be indicated by A, the value of the training provided by the first firm, plus theta, the match dimension, yes, minus the wage that the worker would have received if the worker were to stay in the first. So then we have two cases which are relevant for us. So the first case in which wages are unrestricted, so minimum wages do not apply, will not be binding. And we show that in this case, training will be conducted at the efficient level. And the idea is that if there are no restrictions on wages, the first firm can always reduce the wage that is offered in the first period so that the cost of the training can be met. And then the firm can ensure that the participation constraint of the worker is met by paying enough in the second period. Okay, so this, of course, may require very low wages, and we know about that in many countries. Apprenticeship wages can be much lower. There may be special exemptions. In some extreme cases, workers may pay for the opportunity to be employed by particular firms because they know that they will receive a lot of training, and that will increase their options in the future in the same firm or in other firms. Okay, but this is the context in which there are no restrictions as far as wage setting is concerned. Then we move to the second context in which these restrictions apply. So minimum wages will be binding, and of course this creates a problem from the firm's perspective. They can no longer reduce the wage in the first period to a level that will ensure that they will deliver the efficient level of training. Okay, so and at the same time, to compensate for that, they may have to restrict the wage in the second period, and this may also create problems in terms of the potential poaching by external firms, because even if they happen not to be very productive in the second firm, the resulting productivity may be such that the worker will want to move to this other firm. Okay, so we show that training will not be efficient under this different context in which minimum wages are binding. And moreover, and more directly in the context of our question, we show that the amount of training decreases in phi. Phi, if you remember, is the probability that the worker receives an offer from the second firm. And this is precisely what will happen if there are no poaching agreements. So, this result indicates that training will be increased under the context of such no poaching. I'm giving you a flavor of the model. There is a second part that we won't discuss here, which is about endogenizing the affiliation decision by firms. There are a number of trade-offs there. But perhaps in the interest of time, let me move to the empirical part. Oh, sorry, I see that there are a number of questions. I missed that. I'm not sure if I will. Okay. So my co-author is making some points. I strongly urge you to read those. I'm sure they clarify important things. Yes. So there are quite a lot of questions. I'm not sure if I. What do you suggest, Matlub?
No,
I address these questions.
I think you should carry on, because I saw Jonathan was replying to some of the questions. So that's why I see. Oh, that's right. So, that's why I didn't interrupt you. So carry on, please.
Great. Okay. Yes, that's great. This is a nice feature of this format. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so let me use the remaining 15 minutes or so to tell you about the empirical findings. So as I mentioned before, this is about the particular case of Portugal, where employer associations are important. Not as important as in some other countries in Europe, but still fairly relevant. Sectoral collective bargaining, that is collective bargaining that is conducted by employer associations, is quite important. So many other countries in Europe where this also applies, France, Germany, Italy, for instance. And with respect to the very previous point of the theory, minimum wages can be quite important as well. So if we consider both the minimum wages coming from the statutory national minimum wage and the minimum wage coming from collective bargaining, this can cover up to 40% of employees. So these will be individuals whose wages will be equal to either the statutory national minimum wage or to the minimum wage that will be applicable in the collective agreement that applies to those employees. Okay, so clearly there is a strong role for these. And of course, if one were to focus exclusively on workers that were hired recently, so workers with lower levels of tenure in their firms, I would say that these percentages would be much higher. So I think there is clearly a context for efficiency issues to be raised on the training levels because of the large role of minimum wages. Yes, so there are some additional information about the affiliation rates of employer associations, a bit on the low side compared to the other OECD countries for which data is available. NPAs, from a formal perspective, are illegal in the sense that they cannot be enforced in a labor court. But I've noticed that competition law seems to be lagging behind a little bit in terms of considering these potential labor market effects of employer associations from the perspective of competition issues. So there are a number of provisions I've found regarding business associations, but not specifically these no poaching arrangements. One final remark on the institutional side about training. So there are some regulations requiring firms to provide the minimum number of hours of training to each employee, but there are a very large number of exemptions and exceptions. So this gives quite a lot of flexibility for firms as to how much training they provide to their employees. So I'm using this QP data set that some of you will already know about. So information on all the employers, all the employees, and then also a longitudinal dimension. So one can follow these firms and these workers over time. For one particular year, I have information on the affiliation status of each firm with respect to an employer association. So I know which employer association they are affiliated to, or if they aren't, I also have that information. And for 2 additional years, I have information not only on wages, but also on the training of each employee. Okay. This is a fairly novel dimension, which has not been used so far in studies using this data set. So for each employee, I know how many hours of training were provided by the firm to that person. Using the nature of the data set, namely the fact that people can be followed over time, I can also identify spells of mobility of work between firms. Okay, so the goal is then to see if the nature of the firm or the type of the firm with respect to the employer association affiliation is relevant in terms of predicting or understanding these spells of interfirm mobility. So to some extent, I already have the ones, the spells of mobility, and then what I do is I construct the zeros, okay? So these are pairs of firms for which such mobility of workers is not observed. Now, I'm not using the full set of potential cases because this would be extremely large number. I do a sampling so that I consider only a subset of the cases in which the mobility is not observed. But I know that those cases are indeed corresponding to instances in which workers have not moved between their firms. Okay? Of course, this requires population data, I believe. Without population data, it's very difficult to trace all the spells of mobility and then construct the complementary group of spells of non-mobility, as it were. So I just give a few examples in the slides. So for instance, I see a worker moving between firm A in 1 year, and then that worker is employed in firm B in the following year. So that will be a spell of mobility. But if I don't see, say, different cases, then I can use that combination of firms as a spell of non-mobility. Okay. I also have a few checks to make sure that this is actually a worker moving between different firms. Sometimes you have these issues with different firms of the same holding group exhibit some mobility. So I make sure that the tenure of the worker in the new firm is indeed set at 0, which indicates that indeed it's a new contract with an entirely different firm, which will be what we think is relevant from the perspective of the paper. And we also drop cases with large flows of workers between firms, which may be about displacement, which is somewhat different. So what we do next is we try to understand if the affiliation of the firm or of the firms, so because we are looking at this from the perspective of pairs of firms and the underlying mobility of workers or not between that particular pair of firms, if this is driven by the employee association status of the two firms. Okay, so we have this simple equation where on the left-hand side, we have some indication of the mobility status, either from an extensive or an intensive perspective. So in one approach, we simply have a 0-1 dummy variable indicating whether there was mobility or not. And in the complementary approach, we actually have a count of the number of workers that moved between that particular pair of firms in a particular direction. Okay, so we are also considering the direction of the mobility between the pair of firms. And then we are interested in the characteristics of these two firms, in particular the very first dummy variable. Okay, so this is a dummy variable that is equal to 1 if the firm I and firm J are affiliated with the same employee association. Okay, so this is the critical variable to assess the scope for no poaching agreements. If when we are considering pairs of this type, we observe fewer mobility spells, that would be evidence that is consistent with our hypothesis that these no poaching agreements are indeed in play. Of course, these pairs of firms, they may also share other attributes that may facilitate the mobility. So these firms will most likely be in the same industry, and that fact alone can facilitate mobility of workers between their firms. If you've already been operating in that industry, then it's more likely that you'll be able to find a job in another firm of the same industry. So we need to control for that, and we have 3 other variables or even 4 other variables that try to pick that out, to partial that out, so that we can then really isolate on the effect of the two firms being or not in the same employer association. Okay, so we have controls for whether these two firms are operating in the same region, under the same collective bargaining agreement, and specifically under the same industry. Okay. So let me tell you about the results. So these are some descriptive statistics comparing or describing these spells of interfirm mobility. So this is about the 79,000 pairs of firms which are connected because there was mobility of workers in them. Okay, and this is the overall larger sample in which we also considered cases in which such interfirm worker mobility was not observed. Okay, so this is a sort of control group, if you wish, highlighting the attributes of the firms in the cases in which there was no worker mobility. So what about the results? So we have 4 specifications. We control for a number of firm attributes, and this is attributes both from the sending firm and the receiving firm, if you wish. We also have firm fixed effects. Some of these firms are observed multiple times, sometimes always not sending or not receiving, sometimes sending but not receiving, so all possible combinations. We then focus on these variables. If we don't control for the characteristics of the firms in terms of belonging to the same collective agreement, the same region, and so on, we actually find a small positive effect. But as soon as we control for these attributes, which play a big role in explaining mobility of workers between these firms, we actually find that same EA affiliation status as a negative relation with the mobility of workers between these firms. Okay, so this is a key result for us. So when we are comparing the firms that meet these conditions, we actually find that if they happen to be affiliated with the same employer association, we actually observe fewer spells of mobility of workers between those two firms. Okay. So this is the analysis where we do a linear probability model. So it's just a 0-1 dependent variable. If we move to the Poisson model, which considers the actual intensity of the flow between the firms in terms of the number of workers that are moving from one particular firm to another, we find consistent, if not stronger results, indicating that same EA affiliation status has a negative effect in terms of the strengths of that worker mobility flow. I'm running out of time. Let me just tell you about the training dimension. We also have some additional information on separations and wages, but let me focus on the training, which is quite important. So we run very simple training equations where we have on the left-hand side a measure of whether the worker received or not training in that firm in that year, or the amount of training that the worker received in terms of the number of hours of firm provided training to that individual. And then on the right-hand side, we have a number of control variables. And we are focusing on the potential role of EA affiliation. Okay, so is it that the training levels of workers in EA affiliated firms are larger, especially after we control for a number of variables? So let me tell you just before showing you the results, these are some descriptive statistics. Okay, we are observing about 5 million workers from 2 years, 2010 and 2011. And we have our training dummy. So this is one, if the worker received training in that year, we find that about 30% of the workers do. And we all see that on average, they receive about 1/3 of a week of training per year. Oh, and of course, I mean, there is a large number of workers that do not receive training, but then we also have many workers that receive 2, 3, 4 weeks of training. Okay? So is that a systematic pattern with respect to the employer association affiliation status of the firm? So this is what we show here. First, we do the 0-1 analysis on training status. We consider a large set of control variables at the firm level, and also worker fixed effects. So we can follow workers over time. It's immediately a short period, only two years, but we can consider cases of workers that potentially move from firms that are affiliated to firms that are not affiliated. So that gives us a little leverage in terms of the identification of this effect. So in the most stringent specification, we are not finding significant differences, but remember that this is the simple 0-1 dummy, and there are some regulations that require firms to provide the training to their employees, even if some exemptions apply. However, when we move to the Poisson model that considers the intensity, the potential intensity differences of the training itself, we find that even in the most stringent specification, in which we control for worker fixed effects, plus a number of firm control variables, we find very substantial differences between EA firms and non-EA firms, namely that workers in EA firms receive about 30% more training than workers in non-EA firms. Maybe this is a good time to have a look at the chat. Okay, so
there's somebody asked me to ask you, Pedro. The question was why Poisson model, why not negative binomial model?
Yeah, I mean, I take note of that. We have a large number of zeros. Yeah, yes. Thank you for that. Very good. So maybe to conclude, okay, we also find some evidence of fewer separations in EA firms. Okay, even considering a number of controls. Now, this can be a little complex because, of course, workers may separate for a number of reasons, not only because of the direct effect of the no-poaching agreements, there are also retirements, there are also involuntary separations, there's attrition for a number of reasons. So we are working in terms of focusing a little better, perhaps, on the specific drivers of separation that may be more directly related to no-poaching agreements, but still looking at this first evidence is again consistent with our thinking about what may be relevant here. And finally, on the wage dimension, so first of all, perhaps just one general remark. I mean, you may argue that these variables are endogenous, of course, but it is interesting to see that training measured in weeks in this case as an effect or a relationship, to be more rigorous, that is not very different from the role of schooling. So I think this is an interesting point. It sort of highlights the very significant potential effects of training in terms of wages more generally. So this is not specifically about the paper now, but more generally, I think training is an important variable that perhaps has not received as much attention as it should. But then more specifically to the paper, we are not finding very significant differences between EA firms and non-EA firms in terms of their wage practices. And indeed, even if we go to a different model where we allow the role of training to vary depending on EA firm status, we are also not finding very large differences, which again can be consistent with the earlier discussion about the potential advantages from the no-poaching agreement in terms of most of the surplus going to the employers that are conducting. So the very last slide, just to summarize and perhaps leave 1 or 2 minutes for questions. We presented very briefly this model on training and worker mobility in the context of employer associations. This can also help us in terms of endogenizing the membership status of the firm and thinking more carefully about the welfare implications of these practices. And then we present a number of empirical results that we believe are consistent with the potential relevance of these no poaching agreements. They are very difficult to pin down because, again, many of those, if they exist, they will be driven by informal negotiations between employers. So we won't be able to find say, written formal evidence of such arrangements. And if these individuals will be surveyed or questioned about this, they are likely to deny their existence. So we have to find a different way to go about it. But we believe these results are consistent with the no poaching arrangements. First of all, we see that these particular links between firms that are affiliated with the same employer association, we observe much fewer spells of worker mobility. So that's consistent with this idea of the no poaching. At the same time, workers receive much more training if they are in firms that are affiliated with employer associations. Separation levels are also lower, and we are not finding differences in wages that potentially could be consistent with the much higher levels of training that workers receive in employer associations firms. So we think in terms of policy that this is an issue that I think deserves more attention from maybe competition agencies. Maybe these are the agencies that are better placed to address this. And more generally, I think there is this possibly important trade-off at play here. Of course, on the one hand, the provision of training is very important, and firms need to have incentives to provide training. At the same time, workers also need to have opportunities to move to different firms where they may get better matches, and in that sense also increase their wages and working conditions.
Okay, Pedro, just one thing. So going back to somebody asked about unions, and so this idea of overall separations are lower in EA firms. That's maybe the reason unions are basically happy about it in a way that, you know, it's a lower possibility of people losing jobs, and therefore, so if you have, I know zero discounting, but in a way, if you think about it, well, I'm going to take a hit for the first few years. At least I won't lose my job. I get the training, and then the wages will come eventually.
That's a good point. It had not occurred to me. Yes, indeed. Trade unions may see, okay, so wages are not increasing in a way that is proportional to the productivity dimension, but at least job stability is much higher, and that's something that unions certainly value. Thank you.
Any other questions?
John?
Yes, please. Yeah, so I'm just thinking that you might want to try to pin down which industries are sort of driving these effects, and I'm just sort of thinking there must be industries in which there are some sort of monopoly power, or monopsony power prevalent, and I'm just sort of thinking of just as you say, sort of like the fast food industry, where a lot of the production technology is embedded in the machines that they use. So the training can be very extensive, but it's only relevant for those particular machines. And then if you go to another fast food restaurant, they have completely different machines. Do you know what I mean? Like there's always a McDonald's type machine that's different from whatever type, you know? And so I think you want to maybe interact this EA with other indicators to try to find a story as to why this is going on. And something about particular industries. So you have an overall effect, but there's going to be some sort of heterogeneity there where you can interact and find out where is it particularly strong, and I think develop deeper your story as to what you think it is that you're picking up.
Yes,
But I mean, very, very interesting data.
thank you. Yes, no, that's a really nice suggestion. Perhaps we can explore the degree of firm specificity of the training.
Yeah.
May have implications in terms of the mobility of workers, regardless of the Employer Association status. I will have to think more about that, but yes, thank you. This is certainly useful. Thank you.
Okay, I think best that we stop here. If you have any questions, I hope, Pedro, it's okay for people to email you.
Yes, please.
Just for this person who asked me about the Poisson and binomial, they sent another saying Poisson kind of forces the variance to be equal to mean, whereas if you do some kind of a chi-square dispersion statistic, it can give you, it can help to decide between the two models that he was mentioning. So just to keep
one point that may be relevant is that I'm using Poisson with a very large number of firm fixed effects. I'm not sure if I can do the negative binomial model in that context. I will look into that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for a very interesting talk. And of course, you know, the data that is quite rich and really great analysis from that as well. So thank you very much again for agreeing. Thanks for everybody's participation. I'll see some of you next month. Bye.
Thank you very much.